The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello, and let me introduce Jay Minkarah, who is Executive Director of the Nashua Planning Commission. Jay, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
People's View.
Thank you.
Tell the people about the commission that you're on, you're Executive Director of.
So Nashua Regional Planning Commission is one of 9 regional planning commissions in New Hampshire, all established by state law. So we are actually a political subdivision of the state. We function, in some ways, we're similar to a municipality. So as I said, there are 9 of us. The Nashua Regional Planning Commission is actually the oldest planning commission in the state. We were established in 1959, so we actually predate the legislation. We were established initially through an agreement between Nashua and Hudson, when there was both communities felt we needed to look regionally at transportation issues. So of course we do more than transportation, but we represent 13 communities, of course including the city of Nashua. So without necessarily naming them all, roughly we go from Pelham in the east out to the towns of Mason, Wilton, and Limeboro in the west. So it's a really very diverse region. Obviously, we have urbanized areas, suburban areas, as well as some fairly rural areas on the outskirts of our region. So I mentioned initially we were created to look at transportation, and I can get into any detail, I guess, that you want. But we've got a handful of primary functions. So we do a lot of land use planning. We do working on local land use plans, master plans with communities, capital improvements programs. We serve as planning staff for some of our smaller communities that don't have their own planning staff, communities like Litchfield, Mason, Wilton. So that's kind of a core land use function. And we do a lot of what we call regional plans. It's actually the only things that we're mandated to do by the state. So we do a regional plan every 5 years. We also do a regional housing needs assessment every 5 years. We have a very strong GIS group. So actually a huge amount of what we do is collecting data and aggregating data and producing maps, all kinds of different data, housing, demographic data, environmental data, and of course a lot of transportation. Transportation is really a huge part of what we do. We are in addition to being a regional planning commission, we're also what's known as a metropolitan planning organization, or MPO. That's a federal designation. And what that means is that we have a formal role in deciding how the federal transportation dollars, both transit and highway dollars that come into New Hampshire, are spent when it comes to our region. So we work very, very closely with DOT in things like the 10-year plan, which is underway again. I feel like we're always in a 10-year planning process. We have some other transportation plans that we are always in the process of working on or updating. And that's mostly focused on that, question of how are these dollars spent with regard to our region? How do we plan for them? So those are the core functions, I guess I would say, that we undertake.
And how are you funded?
So a few different ways. Very good question. Most of our funding is federal transportation dollars, and that's specifically those flow through the NHDOT. And they come to us. So every 2 years, I should say, we propose a work program to DOT for how we're going to basically participate in this planning process. And so that's about 70% of our funding, 69%, I guess to be specific. We're also supported by local dues of our communities. That's the second largest chunk. So all 13 communities are member communities. We are a member organization, which I think is important to note. We are governed by a board of commissioners that's made up of representatives from each of our communities. It's weighted by population, so both the dues and the number of representatives depend on population. Right now we have 31 commissioners who meet quarterly. Then we have an executive committee. We also staff the Nashua Region Solid Waste Management District. So if anybody's ever been out there for a household hazardous waste collection,
Yeah, that's it.
we operate those on behalf of the district. That's also a source of funding for us. And in some ways, we function as a consulting firm because we're also doing work on a contract basis for various communities. And of course, like any organization like ours, we pursue a number of grants. So as an example, you may have seen we recently got a $300,000 grant from the US EPA for our Brownfields Assessment Program. And so that's actually a really exciting program. We're really pleased to be able to kind of revive that. And so of course, grants are a source of funding as well. So that's kind of, I think, that's everything. That's all the sources of funding that are out there.
Okay. How far north do you go towards Manchester? I mean, I didn't.
The farthest towards Manchester would be Litchfield, Merrimack.
Okay.
Depending on how you want to look
Bedford
at it.
and up above that's all in that planning
That's right.
commission.
The Regional Planning Commission for the Manchester areas is called the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, Regional Planning Commission. And we work, of course, very closely with them. And then to the east, communities like Salem and further east is the Rockingham Regional Planning Commission.
Okay. And are those in different categories for federally? I mean, I know they have different, like how far they're away from Boston, for example. Are they?
Right.
How does that work?
So I mentioned we have 9 regional planning commissions. 4 of the regional planning commissions are MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, and that's because we're all urbanized, and of those, 2 are within the Boston metro area. So the 4 that are MPOs are not surprisingly Southern New Hampshire, Rockingham, and also Stratford.
Okay.
And then the other 5 are what are considered rural. And they also have a role in transportation planning. It's very, very central to them, but it's not quite as strong a role, and their level of federal funding is significantly lower.
And your biggest then is transportation, and I know you're on the rail committee from the Nashua city itself, and you get involved with the DOT, and I understand that you're also looking at bus transportation on a longer scale.
Yes.
And I understand that Keene has the same kind of analysis going on for the buses. Is that true?
Keene also, of course, Southwest Regional Planning Commission, which includes Keene, is very, very interested in particularly intercity bus service. That's of acute interest to them. Right now, there is actually, DOT has put out a request for proposals for an operator to operate a daily bus service between Keene and Nashua.
Oh, really?
So we're optimistic that we could see something happen. Right now, there is 1 Greyhound round trip per week. That is between Keene and Boston running through Nashua. So needless to say, 1 a week is not a particularly robust level of service. So we would like to see something obviously daily, much more frequent. I think that would be really, really great for both of us. There are a fair number of students, from Nashua who go to Keene State, so it would be, obviously significant for them. And just generally, there's in particular a need for folks out in that region to travel to Nashua. If it were to move forward, almost certainly it would be focused on, there'd be a stop at Exit 8 that also will allow you to connect with Boston Express. Right. That would provide service, obviously, both to Manchester and critically to Boston. So that would be a really important link. I mean, in all the transportation planning that we do, we look to maximize, multimodal transportation alternatives for our region. So that's a great example of how you can achieve multimodal, alternatives, because Nashua Transit service, the bus service for Nashua, also goes to Exit 8. So there's an opportunity to link both a local bus transit system with an intercity one, 2 different intercity services, which I think would be really, really fantastic.
How do you picture the intercity buses functioning? Are they just two stops, one at either end, or do they stop in between, or is it just sort of if you're on the street, they travel and you wave them down, they'll stop?
Well, so it depends on where. And you're always trying to balance
Right.
maximizing service in terms of coverage, but also making sure that you have the trip duration is reasonable, because obviously the longer the trip, from end to end,
Right.
the less desirable it is. So that's always a balance that you try to achieve. And all these things are still evolving. But right now, if we were looking at Keene to Nashua, there is a strong likelihood of a stop in Peterborough, which Peterborough is very interested. Probably not a lot more than that, and you wouldn't be able to flag it down. I mean, really, even with Nashua Transit, there are many, many bus stops, but they are stops.
Yeah.
And it is important because you got to meet a schedule.
Yeah.
So that's really critical. When it comes to Boston Express, there's also only a limited number of stops. And I could be wrong on this one, but you leave Manchester, you've got Exit 8 in Nashua, you've got to stop in Tingsboro. I think that's it until you get to South Station. You've got South Station, you've got Logan. I could be wrong on that. There might be some more, at least in some times a day.
So, I think in the commuter type of business.
Right.
Nice
And I think you might have I think there could be some additional stops in Boston, but the critical link there is Logan Airport and South Station. Those are the most important, and so that's really what serves our region. We are looking at two transit expansion studies. So right now we're undertaking a feasibility study of expanding Nashua Transit service to some of the adjacent towns, specifically Hudson, Merrimack, and Milford via Merrimack and Amherst out 101A. So that's active now. We've been out there, and actually, I would encourage any of our listeners to provide us input on this. But we have been in the public outreach and information gathering stage. So what we've been looking to do is try to determine what the potential ridership is, what the desirability is, and where do people want to go.
How do they contact you to give you that information about what they'd like to see?
Certainly people can go on our website and go that way, but quite honestly, I'd encourage people to contact me directly. It's jaym@nashuarpc.org. And again, that's jaym@nashuarpc.org. We've done some on-bus surveys. So we've done a fair amount of surveying of people who are currently riding Nashua Transit. Where do you want to go outside of Nashua and outside of the city limits of Nashua? And then we've also been holding outreach meetings in each of the towns that we're targeting. We've done an online survey. So we're trying to get as much input as we can. We're also estimating ridership now, and we'll be going through a process of establishing some preliminary alternative routes, and then we'll be back out to the public to get input on that. So that's something that we think has, that we're encouraged by. I will say Nashua does currently operate a pilot program of a service to Walmart in Amherst. And I think many of our listeners might not be surprised that for a lot of folks on Nashua Transit, Walmart is the #1 destination outside the city. So that's a place where a lot of people want to go. Same thing with Walmart and Hudson. That's a desirable location for folks. So, but we do need to see not just where do Nashua residents want to go, but where do people outside Nashua? Where do they want to go?
Right.
So, so that's exciting. We will wrap this study up, the feasibility study up, by the end of this calendar year, and then we're jumping right back into another one, which we're also really excited about. We'll be looking at the feasibility of providing transit service. And this kind of goes back to what we were chatting about earlier on rail, I guess before we started. But we'll be looking at the feasibility of extending a transit service between Nashua and Lowell, between the Gallagher Terminal in Lowell, which is the MBTA commuter rail station. That's also the Lowell Regional Transit Station. So a possible extension of transit service to Lowell would allow us to link in both to commuter rail and to the regional bus service around Lowell, which is pretty extensive. In addition to the city of Lowell, they're providing service out to a lot of the major employers on 495.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. Have you done that around here for the major employers in the different industrial parks?
So we're doing that as a part of the Nashua transit expansion. Here, we are looking at the major industrial parks, especially Hudson, Milford, Merrimack. But this study would also look at the next phase of the study will be looking at plugging into Lowell and also Alewife. And this is something that we think has a lot of potential. Alewife is particularly interesting because it has we have a lot of folks from this region who are commuting into Massachusetts. A lot, actually. Over 30% of Nashua residents are commuting to jobs in Massachusetts. For Hudson, it's almost 34%, about 34%, so quite substantial. So we're looking at our commuters and accommodating them. When it comes to Lowell, we're also looking at our students. There are a lot of people in Nashua who are now going to UMass Lowell. So that's an important connection for us. Alewife is attractive because whereas Lowell is commuter rail and regional bus, Alewife is MBTA Red Line. So now you're plugging in directly into the Red Line, which, as you can appreciate, is connecting us to Harvard, to MIT, to highly desirable pools of especially younger tech employees in places like Somerville and Cambridge, as well as Boston. Mass General is on that line. And of course, again, South Station is on that line. So that's a really, really potentially, I mean, for us, that's quite exciting. But it's not only about getting our residents, our workers, and our students to Mass, it's also about attracting that reverse commute.
Right.
If we could connect to the rail line in Alewife, potentially also in Lowell, we really have the potential to pick up that reverse commute and service some of our large employers who, as you know, with unemployment rates as low as we have currently in New Hampshire and in our region in particular, we have major employers hungry for workers.
That's right.
The more we can accommodate that, the better.
And some of the workers want to go for advanced degrees too, and they go to night school to pick up a master's or even a PhD nowadays.
Exactly. And the other thing we know is Boston has some of the best hospitals in the world. And we have many residents in our region who are traveling to Boston for specialized medical services. And providing transit linkages is a real opportunity for those folks, particularly those who either have difficulty driving or, as so many people do, no matter what your capabilities are, driving in Boston can be a challenge for folks who are not used to doing it regularly. So the more alternatives that we can provide, we think the better.
I imagine you've been familiar with a lot of other planning commissions throughout the country. And have you found any good ideas that some people are using out there? I mean, do they have certain plans for people who are working for a job, or for having special pricing commissions, or even tying up with somebody like Lyft or Uber as far as continuing to the person to get the person to where he wants to go, to the individual site?
I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of exciting things that are happening out there. Of course, we are in a time of rapidly changing technology. And it's not just that the technology is changing, the applications of the technology are changing. And so just even keeping up with those changes is dizzying sometimes, but there are some really exciting things happening out there. So one example that we thought was particularly interesting was there is a Middlesex 3 coalition that is right across the border. And what they are is a transportation management association, a TMA. similar in some ways to the way we operate, but they're not a planning organization as much as they do planning. But they are actually providing employer-funded shuttle services between major employers in the 495 area, 128 area, and actually specifically Alewife. And it was really through conversations with them that we became to appreciate the Alewife connection. And the reason they're doing that is it's almost entirely reverse commute. Those major employers along 495 in particular need to get workers to them. And so these shuttle type buses, these are not your full-size buses, they are a shuttle type vehicle. It seems to be working, the demand is there, and the fact that it's employer funded, or at least mostly employer funded, we thought that was particularly interesting. It's how they're providing the service and it's how they're paying for the service that we thought was attractive. You may have heard recently about a late night alternative that's being, I would say, piloted now in Boston, which we also thought was particularly interesting. This is primarily the hospitality industry. I believe MBTA service in Boston shuts off at about 12:30. So you've got these late night workers who typically, particularly if you're working in the in bars and in some of the restaurants, you've got a 1 a.m., a 2 a.m. close. You're still there for an hour or two after. How do these folks get home? And so what they've piloted is a program with Uber and Lyft where Uber and Lyft are subsidizing a percentage of the ride, and the restaurants, the bars, are subsidizing a portion of the ride, and the employee is paying. So I forgive me if my numbers aren't exact, but I think those rides are costing about $5.50 for the employee.
That's not bad.
That's not bad at all compared to what they've been paying, $15 or more. So that's a great way of looking at a private company that's offering an on-demand service and teaming up with employers. And of course, there's an employee portion there also. So that's pretty interesting. And these are the kinds of things that I do think we need to be looking at. I know that in Boston they have also, which I was going to say was a pilot program. I actually think that they have institutionalized it now, where they're working with Uber and Lyft to provide the ride services, to provide the paratransit services. That's also really very interesting, and there seems to be a fair amount of success around that. So I think the more that we can look at alternatives out there that can stretch our public dollars further, I think it's really, really important to be engaging employers where the employer is needs to be a part of the equation, where they're the demand generator, and also major institutions. So there's a lot of work around the country with universities who are also looking at either providing or partnering on transit services. Hospitals are another one. Hospitals are major employers, and as we know, major draws. One of the biggest challenges we have, that's probably stretching it too far, but a challenge that we have in healthcare, particularly with lower income populations and transit dependent populations, is missed appointments. Missed appointments obviously are to the detriment of the health of the patient, of the individual, but they're also a cost on our healthcare system. And so the more we can do to avoid missed appointments, obviously the better off everybody is. So transit's a part of that. How can we partner with institutions, with healthcare, healthcare providers, with patients, with the public sector to help break down those barriers? And what does that look like when it comes to transit? What does that look like? That could be as small as a simple vehicle or a van. It could be something more than that. How does it function? So I think there's a lot of exciting things happening out there. Of course, we're also seeing a whole lot more with bicycle and pedestrian accommodations. That's the critical part of the equation also. As I think about multimodal transportation alternatives, when it comes to bus service, I think we have to appreciate that virtually every bus trip begins and ends with a pedestrian. Somebody is almost always walking to a bus stop and they're almost always walking away from a bus stop. Granted, some people may be dropped off or picked up right at the stop, but most cases. So that's something that we've got to think about. What are the sidewalk accommodations on either end of those trips? Are there adequate crosswalks? Can people get across? If I'm dropped off on this side of the street, I'm going to pick it up on that side of the street. Can I get there? So we have to be thinking about those kinds of things. And of course, bicycle accommodations, we are making some real strides. And of course, as we've seen, we've got the bike share that you see primarily around the downtown area right now. Scooters came out most recently. So will those wind up being a viable transportation alternative? Who knows? Maybe they will.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of talk about that last mile. And so that's where some of these alternatives come in. They're really, generally, they're last mile alternatives for folks. Some people, of course, can go a long distance. I walk a lot. To me, what's walking distance? Easily a mile. For other folks, it's a quarter mile. But integrating these into our transportation system, these alternatives as well, is really critical.
You were talking about transportation. I think the east-west transportation, or the roads, I should say, are not ideal. You have input on that to DOT? Have they talked about doing something with the western port of 101, let's say, or to make it like the eastern port, have a really fast-flowing? And I was wondering whether it would be something you could partner with Massachusetts and having, the very northern part of Massachusetts also benefit by location of the road.
Interesting. Definitely 101. 101 has been on the radar for a long time, and we are looking at making improvements to 101. DOT is looking at those. We will be doing a 101 corridor study this coming year. 101A is always an issue. So is 111, and one of our biggest challenges at this point is the Taylor Falls Bridge. When we talk about east-west, it's getting across that river is one of the greatest bottlenecks. So that's something that we're looking at. And other improvements in Hudson Boulevard, which is a portion of the old circumferential highway, 102. So yeah, east-west is a challenge, and it's definitely on our radar.
And the circumferential highway is on the list again?
No, it is not on the list. Not in the way it was.
Okay.
Hudson Boulevard is back on the 10-year plan, and that would be a modified version of a portion of the circumferential, similar to the Broad Street Parkway. That became reduced in scope.
Yeah. Would that be another bridge across the Merrimack on Exit 9?
No. It would be the southern portion, and it would tie into the Sagamore Bridge.
Yeah, okay. Because I think they actually need another one for the northern part, too, because getting through the roads in Nashua for that northern crossing is just...
Right. That is no longer in the 10-year plan.
Yeah. Well, I know it isn't, but it probably should be. Well, Jay, maybe we have you back towards the end of the year and see what's accomplished. I'm kind of very interested in seeing not only north-south, but east-west. And I think we can really grow both the northern part of Massachusetts as well as the southern part of New Hampshire.
I'd be more than happy to come back. There's no end to the things that we could talk about.
Right. Well, thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.